Hello and welcome to On Record with TAC. Today we are joined by Mr. Tenzin Tsundue. He is a poet, a writer, and one of the most prominent Tibetan freedom activists living in exile. Known for his fearless protest actions, he has spent decades combining literature, philosophy, and activism to keep the Tibetan cause alive. A recipient of the Picador Outlook Prize and author of 5 acclaimed books, his work is taught in universities across the world as he remains an unwavering voice for the Tibetan resistance and independence. Mr. Tenzin, welcome.
We will start with our first question, Mr. Tenzin. You were born in exile and have spent your life both as a poet and an activist for the Tibetan cause. To begin with, how do you personally carry the weight of representing a struggle that many governments are unwilling to talk about openly in today's day?
In any freedom movement, the most important power is the power of the people. Whether there's a support or recognition of someone else, or if your adversary is too powerful, it doesn't really matter. What matters is if you continue with the conviction and work hard, there's also always this possibility of bringing about the freedom at the end. And as far as the issue of Tibet is concerned, the 7 million Tibetans inside Tibet, they are the ones who have been leading the Tibetan freedom movement in the past 75 years under the Chinese occupation. And then on the outside, there is His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Tibetan government in exile, Tibetans in India, Nepal, Bhutan, in Europe, in America, and everywhere in the world. Although there is not a single government which recognizes Tibet as an independent country and who supports the Tibetan independence movement now, we have the greater sympathy of the world. People around the world support His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people. And everybody knows, over and above all the clamor and the propaganda of China, one smile of the Dalai Lama is more powerful than all the China's weapon and money put together.
So we'll talk a little bit about Tibet under occupation. The Chinese government still claims that in its 1950 takeover of Tibet, they call it was as a peaceful liberation. But for Tibetans, it is marked the end of sovereignty. It is marked by cultural destruction and mass exile. So how do you explain to the global community that this was in fact an occupation and not a peaceful integration?
Yeah, firstly, just the very fact that China brutally led a military invasion of Tibet, right from the end of 1949 and beginning of 1950. And Tibet fought a major battle in a place called Chamdo, and where the Tibetan resistance movement faced a major debacle. This was the first important battle. It shows that Tibet was a free and independent country. It was resistance against invasion. And therefore, for China, it is their attempts in invading Tibet. So it clearly shows that Tibet was a free and independent country. And right that very year, the issue of Tibet was raised at the United Nations. Many countries, including El Salvador, Malaya, Ireland, Thailand, they raised the issue of Tibet. So it is important to recognize this first. Secondly, China calls that peaceful liberation of Tibet for 2 reasons. They're saying that Tibet was a feudal society run by aristocracy, and that they were liberating Tibet from Western imperialism. But at that time, there were only 3 Westerners, the entire country of Tibet. And even if they were saying that it was a peaceful liberation, but after the liberation, they must go back to their own country. No, but they continue to stay on. So, which is a clear indication that it was a military invasion of Tibet and continued occupation.
So we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly happened in 1950 first. In 1950, Tibet was India's northern neighbor, not China. How did the occupation of Tibet fundamentally alter India-China dynamic? And what are the geopolitical consequences we still live with today? Because India was at the time a newly formed nation. And in that time, do you think that India had the chance to maybe resist China's occupation of Tibet? And could that have maybe changed South Asia's security architecture?
That's too tall an order, too many questions in here. But in 1950, when the first issue of Tibet was raised at the United Nations, India did not support Tibet. In fact, India's intervention was that there was China's invasion of Tibet was a problem, a conflict between the Tibetans and the Chinese, and India said that it should be allowed to resolve on its own. And therefore, many countries actually abstained from directly supporting Tibet. At the time, the government of the day at the time in 1949, 1950, India was inheriting a colonial British policy. And this we must remember today. And therefore, I have always been very strongly saying India's foreign policy should be decolonized. And why should India continue to look at Tibet from a British colonial perspective? And the British colonial perspective was what used to be called the Great Game, where the Britishers looked at Tibet within creating an ambiguous position of Tibet. Tibet was a free and independent country, but the Britishers looked at Tibet as an autonomous region. At the same time, physically keeping Tibet as a safe buffer zone from the dangers from Russia from the north and China to the east. And therefore, the Britishers created almost about 3,000 square kilometers of land to the north of the Himalayas, safe from attacks from China and Russia. So this was the Britishers' game. But now this is India. India needs to look at Tibet from India's perspective, not to keep Tibet as a buffer zone. So therefore, it is important and pertinent for India today to look at Tibet historically from Ladakh perspective, from Uttarakhand and Himachal perspective, from Sikkim, and also from Arunachal Pradesh perspective, from 5 important Indian states to look at Tibet from that perspective and recognize squarely Tibet as an independent country in the history, and to envision in future India-Tibet relations. Now, it is important to do that because China continues to, even today, whatever warming of India-China relations, China has never abandoned this expansionist policy towards India. And China continues to say that Ladakh is theirs, Arunachal Pradesh is theirs. So it is important for India to, completely look at Tibet perspective and look at Tibet from India's position. So one of the positions of power, look at Tibet, is to look at Tibet as in the history independence of Tibet, and which is reflected in India's Arunachal Pradesh position. Because Arunachal Pradesh was formed after British India and Tibet's entering into the negotiation of what is called the McMahon Line Treaty.
Sir, so what you're trying to say is that India should look at Tibet through a decolonized lens. Sir, right now we talk a little bit more about the systemic oppression that is going on in Tibet. Tibet today is described as one of the heaviest surveilled places in the world right now, with DNA connection, facial recognition, and grid policing. Sir, what is the daily life like for Tibetans who are currently living in Tibet under Chinese occupation, under this authoritarianism?
Well, firstly, let me say a little bit about just the location of Tibet. Very often among Indians, when I talk about Tibet, most Indians actually think Tibet is this small country near Nepal or Bhutan or Ladakh or something. In reality, Tibet is 2.5 million square kilometers of land. 25 लाख स्क्वायर किलोमीटर के एरिया है. From Ladakh, from the Karakoram Mountains, from Ladakh, all the way across the Himalayas, from Himachal, Uttarakhand, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, Arunachal, right up to Burma border on the other side is Tibet. It is that big. So the Tibetan plateau, geographically, it makes Tibet the highest country in the world. The highest plateau in the world, biggest plateau in the world. It is a country that stands on an average 4,000 meters above sea level. It experiences almost 8 months of winter, extremely cold, like minus 20 and 30. So right in the center, in the heart of Asia is Tibet, where there is China to the east and Mongolia to the north, East Turkestan to the northwest, and to the south, all the South Asian countries. So it is such an important place and rich with natural resources. And most importantly, the water tower of the world. Some of the most important rivers all over South Asia, including from Pakistan right up to Bangladesh and Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and also to China. Some of the most important waters in Asia originate from Tibet. So there's such an important, piece of land. Now, there the population is very limited. It's a very scarcely populated land, but rich with mineral resources and water. So, and this very land of Tibet has been under Chinese occupation for 75 years. So, what had happened in the recent 75 years is that China killed more than 1 million Tibetans. 10 लाख से ज्यादा Tibetan लोगों को China ने मार डाला. And they destroyed more than 6,000 monasteries. Some of the most important Buddhist monasteries, almost about 1,000-year-old monasteries and libraries were set on fire and destroyed completely. This was the Chinese communists who were coming to attack Tibet to destroy what is called the traditional culture and resistance. Because China looks at Tibetan culture as a uniting factor. They want to destroy that. Now, what is happening in Tibet today is China is throwing out Tibetan nomads and farmers from the ancestral pasture land and push them away into artificial villages. Like how the white Americans and Canadians created reservations for the Native Americans, this is exactly what is happening in Tibet today. China is making artificial villages where Tibetan nomads and farmers who've been grazing their yaks and sheep, they are forcibly put into these kind of artificial villages, and these pasture land, mountains, are bombed, and China is mining. Some of the key metals are being mined from Tibet. Gold, copper, most importantly, lithium and rare earths. China has been promising to sell rare earths to India and also to Donald Trump in the United States. But these rare earths, China is mining in our country, Tibet. And China has been doing that. And so what China has been doing is, China has been mining the 2.5 million square kilometers of Tibetan land. And the result of all that mining goes into all the Chinese industries. And they are churning out some of the largest amount of consumer goods and electronics and selling into countries around the world. Entire world has been benefiting at the cost of Tibet. We are not suffering. Our country has been devastated. Our people are being jailed and killed and tortured. And now China is targeting the last and important reservoir of Tibetan culture, which is Tibetan language. China has destroyed all traditional Tibetan schooling system, turned all schools into government-run colonial boarding schools, where from the age of 5, every kid must be sent to these colonial boarding schools, and they've been giving Chinese communist indoctrination from the age of 5. And this has been going about. Now we fear in the next 5-10 years, what is going to happen to Tibetan children? And China is giving Tibetan children Chinese language education, keeping only Tibetan as in some of the schools as an alternative subject, but largely in Chinese language. So this amount of death and destruction, and this is the country, kept under surveillance, not just physical mobility, but DNA mapping, landscaping. China has taken, DNA samples from almost about 1 million Tibetans, and also face mask. Around the world and also in the media, Freedom Press, Freedom House in the United States have also said that Tibet is the most suppressed country under surveillance, worse than North Korea and Syria. So this is the condition. So this is the new model of colonialism. This is neo-colonialism, where China has been mining in Tibet and selling products to countries around the world. Everybody is benefiting at the cost of Tibet. And this is the new model. So therefore, no one wants to question China on Tibet, because everybody is a beneficiary. And not just Tibet, East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, Manchuria, all of them are under Chinese colonial occupation.
Yes, sir. So this is what they call the Sinicization project by China. Sir, you have been detained and imprisoned briefly in Tibet a few years ago. We want to understand a little bit about what your experience revealed to you about the nature of China's control and surveillance in Tibet through your perspective, having been imprisoned there.
Well, this happened many years ago, but this was my way of understanding what is happening in Tibet today. So after my graduation, I went to Ladakh. From there, I crossed Ladakh-Tibet border on foot, alone. And after going into Tibet, I got arrested. I'm born and brought up in India. I'm raised here. I'm like any other Indian. Just that I'm Tibetan. And therefore, for me, the Tibetan freedom movement is my first responsibility. So when I went to Tibet, when I got arrested in jails in Tibet, I got first-hand experience of what it amounts to be in jail in Tibet. I understood that they were looking at me as an Indian because I was born and raised here and having been to Tibet. But in the jail, I've seen how Tibetans were being incarcerated, jailed, beaten, tortured. I've met with these political prisoners. So for me, this was true understanding of what was happening in the depth of Chinese colonization of Tibet, and how Tibetans, without knowing the sense of freedom and democracy in the outside world, they had never given up and they continue to fight for their freedom.
So, but one question that I have is, when we talk of China's occupation and how China is extracting all these rare earths and minerals, exporting it out to the world, and the world benefiting from it. So when China occupied Tibet, they say that their policies, they are labeling it as modernization. Right? They say that they are developing Tibet. So, sir, how do you counter a narrative like that?
Well, that's very convenient to say, condescendingly, China has come all the way to Tibet in what they call the Western, remote, difficult terrain to modernize Tibet. But why? Why don't you modernize your own country? Why have you come to Tibet to, firstly liberate Tibet and then modernize? Now, if you look at this, we have seen over and over many revisionist policies on Tibet. Firstly, when they entered Tibet, they said they were coming to Tibet to what they call, peaceful liberation. Now, if you have come to Tibet to liberate Tibet, after liberation, why don't you go back to your own country? Why do you want to squat in Tibet? Firstly. Secondly, in the 1980s, they changed their narrative. In the 1980s, they started to say that they have come to Tibet to develop Tibet, modernize Tibet. And they also started to prescribe modernization and developments in Tibet, and they looked at Tibet as orthodox and backward, and they even said Tibetans as barbarians. And now the third narrative, revisionist narrative, is that Tibet had always been a part of China, which was never their perspective in the past. Now the latest and the most latest narrative that they're giving is not only Tibet, but East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, and Manchuria. China is saying that all these have always been part of China. So this is coming about based on a very old, history, which is the Manchu history. The Manchus used to rule over China. Like India, China was under foreign occupation. Firstly, under the Mongols, and later under the Manchus. Mongols ruled over China for almost about 100 years. Then Manchus ruled over China for 250 years, right up to 1911. Now what China is saying is, Manchu were not a different country and a people, but Manchu is China. Now what they're saying is, Mongols were not a different people and a country, but China is saying is theirs. So they are not only physically occupying land, China is colonizing history. This is what entire world must recognize and look at history. Who can contest the history of Mongolia? Genghis Khan was one of the biggest empire builders in the world. From Eastern Europe right up to China Sea and up to Japan was under Kublai Khan's rule. China is denying that. And strangely, and to utter discussion, much of the Western countries are agreeing to China's narrative because they have trade and supply chain benefits. This is contradiction, and this is absolute agreement to China's colonization.
So this is what I wanted to come to next. China's one China policy, right? So compared to other occupations like Xinjiang, when we talk about East Turkestan, Tibet is often disappearing from international headlines at times, even Hong Kong for that matter. Has the world, in your view, accepted China's narrative politically and from all security perspectives, all perspectives, have they made peace with in China's current boundaries from all sides?
Now, when we look at the international community's perspective, I always think and believe that there's no charity in politics. Everybody looks at China and Tibet from their own national interests, including India. So therefore, whatever was always beneficial to them, whether it's Great Britain at one point of time, on America and India, they would always look at Tibet and China from their own national interests. For example, last year, United States, for the first time, changed its national policy and started to say that Tibet was a free and independent country, unlike what China has been saying. And also, United States said that Tibetan people have right to self-determination, and that the conflict between China and Tibet, United States said that it should be sorted out by dialogue. Now, United States is saying this not because the United States suddenly found a new love for Tibet, but because for United States to dislodge China's rising power and also the threat to United States, it is their national interests to question China's what is called occupation, what China is doing in Tibet. So, for the first time, United States is looking at real history, China's occupation of Tibet. Now, that is in the interest of India also. United States has also looked at India and said that McMahon Treaty or McMahon Line is India's borders with Tibet. So these are important developments. At the end of the day, I always believe that whatever policies will continue to change. But in the heart of heart, every individual in the world know that Tibet was a free and independent country, and that the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people deserve freedom, like all other 206 UN recognized countries are.
Sir, so then when we speak of democratic nations like India, US, Japan, and European powers right now, sir, what more can democratic nations do to prevent the erasure of Tibetan identity, history, and culture? We saw that it was Dalai Lama's birthday a few months ago, and a few countries wished him and acknowledged Tibetan resistance. So, sir, what more can we expect from other democratic nations on this?
We need to look at China squarely, not just for the transactional business and trade supply chains perspective. China today is the biggest colonial empire. China is the biggest slave empire in the world. And sadly, China is a country where there's no freedom, democracy, where there is freedom of speech is completely negated, and every protest dissent is clamped down violently. So all the democracies in the world must look at China from this perspective also. Because as much as you value your freedom and democracy, you must respect freedom and democracy of the what is called the 1.4 billion Chinese people. Everybody is taking advantage of Xi Jinping's dictatorship in China. That you're willing to trade with Xi Jinping, the dictator, but you have problems with Kim Jong-un. You have problems with many of the Middle East countries. But what of China? I think as much as I've always been saying, all the countries who trade and receive supply chains from China have responsibility for the freedom and democracy in China's occupied countries like Tibet, East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, Manchuria. And what about the Chinese people? The common, ordinary 1.4 billion Chinese population, they also deserve freedom. I'm in touch with many Chinese who are fighting for freedom and democracy in China. They are one of the most, oppressed people in the world. But no one talks about it because everybody has been benefiting from Xi Jinping's dictatorship there. So it is responsibility of all the democracies in the world to come together and also support the voices for freedom and democracy in China, and also people who are under Chinese occupation.
So even within China, there is no freedom of movement, right? You need to have certain qualifications, even for the Chinese people to travel to say Shanghai. So that is something that is also, people don't talk about that. People don't see China through that lens. So, sir, coming to now the present, what we are seeing even right now, even Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, just concluded his meeting with Mr. Xi Jinping. And sir, we see that due to Trump's policies and Trump's aggression towards India, India may be having a cautiously approaching China, but also maybe a little bit of normalization of relationships. So there are a lot of other geopolitical developments that are happening which also influence these relationships. So what is your point on this?
No, I think what is called the recent thaw and warming up relationship between India and China, I think is largely being pushed by corporate interests. And I'm speaking very squarely and openly, frankly. I think India is for the third time entering into a treacherous area and is going to be a debacle for the third time after 1962, 2020 Galwan Valley, and this will enter into a disaster. And it is really important for this government to walk cautiously and not enter into China's treacherous backstabbing policies. As someone who was born and raised in India, I love India as much as I love Tibet. And I wouldn't want, India to enter into such a treacherous area again. What China is doing is China is playing India against United States. United States and India are natural partners with high idealism of democracy and freedom, which is not there in China. And if India looks at trade and supply chain only and also molds its foreign policy on that, it is bound to enter into difficult areas. And tomorrow, so that we do not regret, it is really important for India to walk absolutely cautiously.
So you have spent more than 20 years on this movement. So since then, what has changed and what has not changed since the time you started wearing your red headband?
Yes, 30 years ago, when I first went to Tibet as a fresh college graduate, Tibet was almost unheard of, either as an issue or as a bilateral issue among many other countries. But since then, a lot of things have started to come about, and Tibet started to come into calculation for many of the foreign policies and trade and supply chains. There is much more awareness in the world about Tibet. And Tibetan people have also started to speak about a much more united Tibetans are on the inside, and a much greater strength and capacity to work in coordination with Tibetans inside Tibet and outside, and many other partners for freedom and democracy, not only with the other people who are also fighting for freedom and democracy within China and in China's occupied countries, and also supporters from around the world. So we are in much a better position today, and the freedom movement is looking upwards. And there was one point of time where issue of Tibet is really unheard and not seen, not coming into any of the calculation. We were ourselves in confusion and lost at one point of time. So we are in a much more hopeful position today. And now is truly time where the issue of Tibet is coming in calculation of many of the countries for their own policies. Many of the Eastern European countries who were under a communist regime, who were invaded and occupied by Russia, they are themselves supporting. For example, Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they have seen this kind of real dangers, not only from communism, but also from military occupation of Russia. Now that all so much of threats caused by Russian invasion of Ukraine and many other countries. So we see, all these countries who have had that kind of experience of communism and also dictatorial regimes, they can appreciate with and also sympathize with the issue of Tibet. So and also the non-violent freedom struggle that His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been single-handedly leading, with all the idealism and also romanticism, but there is a strength in it. Non-violence and peace is something everybody is talking, but no one is doing anything. Everybody's, immediately right in the first hand, they're willing to either support Israel or Palestine on one side, Ukraine and Russia on the other side. But no one is truly making an effort for peace. So here is an opportunity. Support His Holiness the Dalai Lama in his non-violent freedom struggle of Tibet. And this can truly bring about a reassurance of path of peace. Because non-violence didn't die with Gandhi. Non-violence didn't die with Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. It is still here. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama is truly a hope for world peace. And this is practically here, because His Holiness and the Tibetan people are even today valiantly leading a non-violent freedom struggle. And this is a great opportunity for the world to once again find reassurance in the path of nonviolence.
So on that note, just my final question is, what message do you want to share with young Tibetans who are growing up under surveillance within Tibet and who are in exile right now, still dreaming to return back to Tibet?
Very often, Tibetan youngsters are judged from their outlook, from the outside. Like many youths around the world, Tibetan youngsters are very quickly being judged for their genes and going to party and different other languages and outgoing. What the Tibetan youngsters are undergoing today is a very unique situation and filled with great angst and anxiety. Here is a youth who were denied of being born in Tibet, having direct relationship with Tibet, the land and the culture. They are born in a foreign country, whether it's India, Nepal, Bhutan, or Europe and America, anywhere. And distinctly, they have a great feel as a Tibetan, belonging to the culture. And yet they cannot go to Tibet. So they are neither here nor there in a kind of a situation. In that there is the only sense of belonging is their culture, the Tibetan Buddhist culture that is nurturing them. So therefore, it is important for every Tibetan youngster to keep that identity, that sense of belonging. And as long as keep this conviction that as long as we do not give up, there is always hope for Tibet. Now, how do we go about liberating Tibet? Is to understand world politics, geopolitics around the world, and also politics of the country where you are in, and relate the issue of Tibet in the national interests of those countries, whether it's Germany or France, United States of Canada, Australia or Japan, or wherever you are. Interpret the issue of Tibet and how important the issue of Tibet is for the national interests. For example, I live in India. I always believe that without Tibet being free and independent, India is always going to be under Chinese pressure. So therefore, for independence of Tibet and for the true, genuine security of India, independence is the only solution for India. And with that, it is possible without having to raise a militant campaign, without getting into terrorism. It is truly possible. Like many of the Eastern European countries, it is possible for Tibet to regain independence of Tibet through peaceful means, and also, juggling with geopolitics and speaking to the national interests of so many other countries, especially when China's, dictatorial regime is a threat to world peace around the world, and especially to the, Western order of the world. The Western order where there is freedom and democracy and rule of law, China is a serious threat. So therefore, we must address this. And Tibet is a great opportunity for that. Thank you.
With that, we come to the conclusion of this interview. Thank you so much, Mr. Tenzin, for joining us and for raising a voice against Chinese occupation in Tibet and for telling us more about what the people are going through. Thank you, and you are watching the Asian Chronicle.
Thank you. Thank you.